Good evening and welcome to Viewpoint. Together with experts and newsmakers, we'll make sense of the week's biggest issues and stories. I'm Barnaby Lo in tonight's conversation.
A case press freedom advocates and human rights activists say should never even have seen trial. Cyber libel, just one of many cases high-profile Filipino journalist Maria Ressa and her web-based news organization Rappler have been charged with following years of attack by President Rodrigo Duterte. On Monday, after only 8 months of hearing the case, a Manila court will be handing down a verdict on what Ressa's accuser says was irresponsible journalism. Observers say it is a test not only of the Philippines' criminal justice system, but of the state of democracy in the country.
And with us tonight, live via Skype, is veteran journalist and the CEO and executive editor of Rappler, Maria Ressa, the woman of the hour, should I say. Maria, thank you so much for being with us. I know, you've been doing media interviews the last 24 hours, so I really appreciate you being here with us. I assume your last interview before the verdict tomorrow?
One more right after. But thank you for having me, Barnaby. And veteran means old, so I'm starting to feel my age.
I should have said Time Person of the Year.
Thank you. Again, old.
So I mean,
I embrace it.
So I mean, the last 24 hours, you have been saying in your interviews that you are ready for any outcome. But now we are moving closer and closer to the verdict. We are now, 14, 15 hours away from when a Manila court will be handing down a verdict on the cyber libel case against you, against your former staff, Renato Santos, and Rappler. So how are you feeling right now that, that it's becoming, that judgment day is getting closer and closer?
I mean, good. Angry, because we have come to this. But at the same time, I've had, even though this trial is among the fastest that we've seen in libel takes years oftentimes, right? But even though it's moved relatively quickly, I've had, essentially 4 years that we've been under attack to really wrap my head around the path that we've chosen. And now we're just coming closer to it. And in a way, it's a 50-50, right? I think that Damocles sword that has hung over my head, it would be great to have it lifted, to have my faith renewed, right? At the same time, even if it's a guilty verdict, even if it is guilty without bail, which is kind of a worst case, I'm told, remote possibility, in this time, we have absolutely no idea what's impossible has become very possible, like the shutdown of ABSCBN. So even in the worst category, I think that I'm okay because it moves it forward. I always say this as a person, like my friends will always know, analysis paralysis, not a big fan of it. I believe in analyzing everything and then making a choice. And this choice is not just going to have an impact on me, on Rappler, on journalists. It will have an impact on Filipinos and perhaps journalists all around the world. It's a very different time. Context is everything. And this context sees journalists, we are doing our jobs in some of the most dangerous situations around the world. Things that shouldn't be dangerous are all of a sudden dangerous. Like in this case, fixing a typo. That's the foundation of this case. Someone in Rappler fixed a typo in 2014, and now I could go to jail because of that.
Mm-hmm. You said a lot of things, so let me pick up on some of those things. You said you're angry. Why are you angry?
I think the pattern is very clear that press freedom has been under attack since 2016. And we use the hashtag hold the line. I always talk about my favorite book, Tim Snyder. He's a Yale historian. He wrote a book called On Tyranny. And one of the first things he said is never voluntarily give up your rights. So hold the line. And you, as a journalist, you know this, the standards and ethics and the mission of journalism. This is actually what's been denigrated by social media, by the propaganda machine that is allied with the government at best and funded by the government at worst, right? That is what they've attacked over the last 4 years. It's exponential attacks on the credibility of news organizations and individual journalists. And this we have cataloged. So I think...
But so you stand by that, because I think that's one of the things that President Duterte has been so angry about, that you keep saying that, propaganda machine has been state-sponsored.
The data is there.
And
Barnaby, the data is there. I don't have to stand by it. You just have to look at the data. It's like saying the Philippines is full of brown people. You know what I mean? The data is there. I'm not challenging the president. He can have whatever opinion he wants. But his is an opinion. Mine is data-driven.
Mm-hmm. And you talked about the worst outcome, which is that you go to jail. And the jail sentence, if I'm not mistaken, is from 6 years to 7 years. So have you imagined that possibility? You said it's a very small possibility, but you're saying that you're not discounting that possibility. And if you do go to jail, what are the bigger implications, you think?
We've long talked about abuse of power, rule of law, and the death of press freedom. And, I will say again that press freedom is not about journalists. The foundation of every right that is guaranteed in the Philippine Constitution rests on the right to know, the public's right to know. That is what journalists do. So if this is a loss, that's a huge loss, not just for us journalists, but for Filipinos. It's funny, even my family is kind of trying to figure out. Oh, that's my niece called. Even my family is trying to figure out why am I not concerned? It's not that I'm not concerned. It's that I'm angry and sad, if that makes sense. I've been through a lot of things. I'm in my 50s, it's just the bad luck of the Duterte administration that they chose a journalist who's been around a long time. I know who I am. I know why I do what I do. I know the standards and ethics of journalism. And you can't really bully me into changing that, because I'm not going to fundamentally change everything because you try to make me afraid. Doesn't mean I'm not afraid, but it also means that I know what's at stake. And I don't make these decisions lightly. And I know that it's not at stake just for me, but also for every Filipino around the world. And when you're carrying that, you don't have a choice but to do the right thing, which is to challenge it, to hold the line. We must. Otherwise, the next generation will have a fundamentally different democracy, if not a democracy at all.
So if you do lose the case, either you go to jail or you lose the case and you post a bail. How is that going to affect the reporting of Rappler? And do you think that will affect the reporting of other media outlets in the Philippines? And in fact, do you think that the reporting of media outlets in the Philippines has already been affected by what's been happening to you, to your reporters at Rappler, and lately what's been happening with ABSCBN? Has there been silencing of media to an extent here in the Philippines?
I think, first of all, even if it's a guilty verdict, even if bail isn't denied, this is still something we will elevate, right? The legal process continues. And that is one of the things the Duterte administration insists on, a veneer of legality. And in that sense, we will continue challenging it. We will hold the line. What's the impact on every journalist in the Philippines? I always talk about the 3 C's: corrupt, coerce, co-opt. 3 C's, and no disparaging. I think the other difference of Rappler is that This is probably the only organization, local organization, that is run by journalists, business-wise and editorially. So we have no other businesses. We are not allied with any other businessmen. When we make a choice editorially, we understand the impact of that. But we've also been able to pivot, right? So I think 2018, Rappler proved that standing by your values is good business. Because 2019, despite the fact that I was arrests like a S with more than one arrest, and then I've had to post bail 8 times just to stay free to work. Despite that, 2019 was a good year for Rappler. And what we have done into 2020, forged and fired. You know, we're like a diamond. Where I feel like it's pushed us to train harder. If there's a guilty verdict, we will do our jobs better than before. You know, this isn't. I should turn that around to you, Barnaby. You know, it's like I think. You know this, right? You do a story that is negative, you're attacked online, as well as the attacks that come at you from government officials. I think that the way to deal with a Damocles sword, and that's kind of what's happened with journalists in the Philippines. I'm a cautionary tale. The same way Laila de Lima is a cautionary tale for politicians. Businesses have a cautionary tale as well. This is a tactic. The way to deal with that Damocles sword is to swipe it away. And, you know, okay, fine. If the cost is that I'm going to have to go to jail. I mean, I used to joke, a little bit of gallows humor, right? I used to joke and say, well, I can finally sleep. But I've gotten some sleep in lockdown. So, you know, I just find it ridiculous that just, 33 years after the People Power Revolt, when we were so jubilant and absolutely certain that we would have an amazing democracy, 33 years, that's when all of the cases began, when everything began to turn. And that is not just the journalists' fault. So the question there is, what can we do?
Mm-hmm.
What have we done?
Since you right, so since you talked about the 1986 revolution, I think that was when you decided to come back to the Philippines from the United States. And I think over the weekend, a lot of people saw the film 1,000 Cuts. And for those who weren't able to see the film, you said in the film that you chose the Philippines as your home. You could have chosen the United States, but you chose the Philippines as your home. And you said that actually you're surprised, you're shocked at what the Philippines has become. Can you expound on that? And do you have any regrets at all, choosing to come back to the Philippines and choosing Manila as your home?
No regrets. No regrets. Look, I come from different worlds. I lived a decade in Jakarta. I grew up in the Philippines until I was 10 years old. And then I grew up from elementary to college in the States. And I've lived my life with the idea that I shouldn't have any regrets, right? No regrets. So these are the decisions that I made. I couldn't decide where home was after I graduated college. And I actually thought maybe I was more Filipino than American. And so I came back to the Philippines in 1986. But then I realized when I was with Filipinos that I never felt as American as when I'm with Filipinos. And I never felt as Filipino as when I'm with Americans, right? So at a certain point, I stopped looking at that as a negative and started embracing it and realizing that that's a strength. It's a great way to be trained for journalism. When I turned 40, I gave myself this deadline that I would choose a home when I turned 40. And I decided that because 40 is a great age. You're young enough to actually keep creating something, but old enough to have real experience. I always say that, the 20s are your experimental years, 30s, you make your choices, 40s, you're master of the universe if you've done it right? And then 50s, reinvention. So when I came home to the Philippines, I came home to head ABS-CBN News. And Gabby tried before that to bring me home, and it just wasn't right yet. And then finally he said, you have to come home. And I listened to him, and it was a great it rooted me in a way that working for CNN did not. Because oftentimes with CNN, I could be in 4 different countries in a week. And you know what it's like to be an observer. You're not part of that society. So here I am. I got what I wished for. I'm part of this society. And guess what? This baton of journalism got handed to me at a time when we have to defend journalism. And I think this may be what the government didn't factor in. I spent my career with other journalists around the world who are now heading news organizations outside of the Philippines. We know each other's work. They know my work. I know their work. And I think that to think that we would buckle, that we would throw away a lifetime's work of journalism because we're afraid, I think they don't know what real journalists are. Right, Barnaby? I don't want to sound boastful or arrogant, because I don't think I am, because I always know, it's funny, the more you learn, the more you know you don't know. Mm-hmm. But I do know that it's almost like my entire career was like going to the gym for the moment when we came under attack. And that's why I don't feel any angst. This is the right thing to do.
But what do you say to critics, as well as to government officials who say, well, this is not about press freedom. This is about Rappler, and this is about Maria Ressa. And this particular report was libelous, and Rappler evaded taxes, and Rappler violated SEC rules. And there is legal basis for all these complaints and cases.
So number 1, actions speak louder than words. Number 2, track record speaks louder than words. And let's just look at this case, right? So the government says, oh, it's a private individual. Let's not just talk about the legal acrobatics that that had to happen in order to get this case in court. But you have an individual who, what did he do? He says he wants to protect his reputation. But the irony, of course, is the article came out in 2012. And then it was more than 5 years later, almost 5.5 years later, that he decided he wanted to protect his reputation. 5.5 years, really? So sorry, you can see a little bit of I'm trying not to be spiky, because I think, look, let me calm down and just say, the track record is very clear. I have a gentleman who in 2002 was named as a suspect in a national newspaper of a murder. And this is the man who filed the cyber libel case. It was thrown out by the NBI's own lawyers because the period of prescription had ended, because it was filed 5.5 years after the article was published. In order to actually have this come to court, the government reversed itself. NBI reversed itself before it sent it to the Department of Justice. When it got there, if you look at the number of lawyers who are in the courtroom, this isn't just being litigated by a private individual. The Department of Justice has prosecutors in there against Rappler. This isn't the case of a private individual. Having said that, let me not go into more detail. I will say 2 other things, right? There are 2 very novel interpretations. I would call them cartwheels that had to be done. And they will impact every Filipino. Number 1 is this idea of continuous publication. This is when I say that I could go to jail because someone in Rappler decided to fix a typo, to fix the spelling of the word. The word was evasion. They changed evasion, EVASION, to evasion, EVATION. That's the only change. And the court now, the lawyers of the private individual says that, oh, well, that's republication. If this stands up, it will have massive implications on anyone who publishes in the Philippines. The second one is the period of prescription. It went from 1 year to 12 years. That meant every Filipino can be sued for up to 12 years. Americans would call that, it's the statute of limitations. Imagine changing that from 1 year to 12 years. So that's huge. But that's just the track record of this one. Then let's put it in the context of how many cases were filed against Rappler in 2018. 11 cases in about a year, right? I don't have to speak.
Yeah. Are you saying that, and I know you've talked about this before, but just, categorically, if you can, are you saying that this is politically motivated? And
absolutely, I've stated that this is politically motivated. It is meant to harass us. It is meant to, like the online attacks, pound us into silence. And, I hope the government realizes that they should be working with journalists, because professional journalists actually help the government do a better job by asking the questions that they may miss, like in COVID-19. Instead of becoming defensive, instead of hiding or ducking, work with the journalists. That's what most professional governments do, right? Competence. So this is, yes, absolutely. I've said that. And I not only compare my government today with all of the other Philippine governments I've worked with since 1986, I compare it with all of the different countries I've worked in. And that's actually a lot of different countries.
You're saying President Duterte has direct influence, and if your answer is yes, then how would that, you think, influence the outcome of the case tomorrow? Or do you still hold out hope that there is complete separation between the executive and the judiciary in the Philippines?
At this point in time, the systems of checks and balances it's essentially collapsing. We have a very powerful executive. He's more powerful than Marcos was, because essentially we live under conditions of martial law without the declaration of martial law. And that's not just what the government has done. It's also the fact that we have COVID-19, right? Imagine the shutdown of ABSCBN on May 5th. Unthinkable. The last time it happened is in 1972, and they were shut for 14 years. So I guess, Barnaby, I've been asked this a lot, in the sense that, does President Duterte have something against you? I don't much care, in the sense that I have nothing personal against Mr. Duterte. He is my president. He is the president of the Philippines. I treat him like I treat every other president that I've reported on. And whether or not he has anything to do with the cases, I can only look at the actions. When President Duterte attacked Rappler using the same language that was astroturfing on social media for almost a year, in July of 2017, he said Rappler was owned by Americans in his State of the Nation address. It's not even like, in confidence to anyone else. When that happens in a State of the Nation address, I was live tweeting and covering that. And I immediately responded, Mr. President, you're wrong. A week later, we got the first subpoena. It was almost like the signal to come in. And then that was the August 2017. By January 2018, we had a closure order. The SEC tried to revoke our license to operate. And then by February, PIA was thrown out of the palace, because we did a story, like everyone else did, on the potential corruption that Bongo, who was then the aide of President Duterte, now he's a senator, which, by the way, that story was actually verified by President Duterte himself. But PIA was thrown out of the palace. We challenged that. And then the palace then went on to throw every single reporter out of every event anywhere around the world. These are unconstitutional acts. And we challenged this at the Supreme Court. And we weren't alone. There were 41 other journalists and academics with us. But I guess, like, the one thing I would say is, like, President Duterte, before all of this, had actually told me that he wanted to be the best president our country ever had. And I actually told him, I said, how can you do that when it is so hard to actually unite everyone? And he said, oh, Maria, I can do that. There's always all these things you can do. There's the BIR, there's this. And I was like, really? Well, now I know, right? Some of my cases are tax evasion. But having said that, I do think President Duterte wanted to do the right thing, and I continue to appeal to him to do the right thing because it's a pivotal moment for the Philippines in a quickly changing world.
But how do you reconcile? I mean, the case that's about to be decided on tomorrow, in particular, is a case that was filed by a private businessman, and you say that it is politically motivated. So how do you reconcile that? You know, a private businessman.
Barnaby, it was already thrown out by the NBI's own lawyer, and then a week later, it was reversed. Right. And then after that, the DOJ stepped in. So, again, I can't talk much more than this about the case because I do respect the judge because she is professional. She runs the courtroom always on time. She actually does all of her filings herself. I've been in so many courtrooms in the last year, and she always struck me as strong and professional. I haven't agreed with the decisions that she's made because part of the reason that this case still flourished is because these novel ideas were essentially turned true, right? The court accepted them. So I think that
I asked that.
Like to hear.
Maria, I asked that because Wilfredo King, who's the complainant in the case, actually came out with a statement through his lawyer yesterday saying that he supports press freedom, but that he just wants more responsible journalism, something to that effect.
I read the press statement, and I, again, will say actions speak louder than words, and let me just throw the facts out there. Fact number one, he wanted to protect his reputation. It took more than 5 years for him to do that. Fact number two, his daughter ran with the government party. Fact number three, in terms of trying not to intimidate the press, well, we saw actions by his lawyers against a newspaper, which actually had a story from 2002 that named him and actually had far more damning evidence. His lawyers contacted this newspaper and intimidated them into taking it down. So, again, I always say actions speak louder than words. Nothing against Mr. King. You are welcome to do what you want to do the same way that I am.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to try to veer a little bit away from the case that's going to be decided on tomorrow. But you did mention ABS-CBN a few times already in the past 20 minutes. When you see what's been happening in the past few months, and in particular what's happened to ABS-CBN, how do you feel about that? Do you feel that vindicates you from people who say, well, this is about Maria Ressa, and this is about Rappler, and this is not about the issue of freedom of the press in the Philippines and the larger issue of the state of democracy in the Philippines?
I think, again, I go back to actions speak louder than words. Rappler isn't the first news organization attacked by the Duterte administration. It was the largest newspaper, the Philippine Daily Inquirer. ABS-CBN was the second that was attacked, right? President Duterte threatened to take away their franchise. His threat became real. Rappler was third. But the difference, I think, with Rappler is because we are not involved in any other businesses. We took a frontal approach. We challenged it. We challenged it publicly. We shone the light. We told you what was happening every step of the way. The fact that the Office of the Solicitor General was the one that demanded the investigation begin is already off. We didn't even know that. We didn't find that out until after the filings, until after the SEC had already revoked our license. We only found that out after that point. And so I guess ABS-CBN, the threat of the president was in 2016. And in 2020, ABS-CBN is shut down. I think that the lesson I've learned in all of this is that if you dock, if you accept a little cut those little cuts will ultimately kill you. And that's one of the things. That's just what the film was about. 1,000 cuts, death of 1,000 cuts. It's funny because the millennials today will think about Taylor Swift's song, like her love song, "Death by 1,000 Cuts," right? But in my mind,
I don't know the song.
See, you're, but for me, you know what I was really thinking about when I said that is actually. So I studied and reported a lot on Al Qaeda and its links in the region. And that is one of the things they've done. It's death by 1,000 cuts. That's what I was referring to in that. It's, in our case, death to the body politic by just having so many cuts that you're just bleeding out. I think that's the state of our democracy today. And words are cheap. And I think here's the other part. Journalists are smarter now. Right? It was very easy when this was filed in 2018. You can do a he said, she said, and we still do he said, she said about the environment. We know where that left us. But in this environment, with the context that we live in, I think the truth will come out because the facts are there.
I guess the question here is, very simple question. Do you think that democracy is dying in the Philippines with everything that's been happening? It's not just the shutdown of ABSCBN. More recently, it's the passage of the anti-terror bill in Congress. It hasn't been signed, but there has been a lot of protest with regards to the passage of this bill.
Barnaby, we are at the precipice. So for the last 4 years, people look away. I couldn't look away because it was being done to me, right? And part of the reason I have always said this is death by 1,000 cuts is I feel those cuts. It seems like, oh, it's business as usual. But we look away. And the fact that I had to post bail 8 times on 8 criminal charges, that's insane. I'm just a journalist. Being a journalist is not a crime. Asking tough questions is not a crime. I'm glad that the government reads us, because I know they do, because there have been shifts in some of the things that we're covering. But of course, so here's where we are today. We're right at the precipice because the anti-terror bill, and look how fast that passed the House of Representatives, right? It's about 5 days. It passed, and it passed Senate in February. So this one now codifies, it puts it into law, all of the abuses of power that many different sectors of society have felt, but we have never actually come together. I'm not an activist, I'm a journalist. And yet, when facts are under attack, when journalists are under attack, we then become activists. I always say, that time when the government arrested me was a big light bulb moment for me because I am an old style journalist. I don't know if I would have been this outspoken if I had not felt firsthand the abuses of power. When they arrested me, my rights were abused. My rights were violated. And I don't even have to talk to a victim to ask them. And I don't have to go through evidence to look at it because I know it's firsthand, right? So the question there is, as a journalist, do I tell you about it or do I not? And for a little bit, I actually thought, well, it's about me, so I should stay quiet. Then I realized if you don't use your voice, you will lose it. And I think that's what I've learned. I've learned
also, we see a lot of Filipinos using their voice now, and especially on social media, of course. We are in the middle of a pandemic. So, we don't see a lot of people out on the streets, but there have been 2 days during this pandemic where people have taken to the streets, really, with hundreds and even, more than 1,000 strong crowd. Do you see, sort of a tipping point for the Philippines?
Can't tell. We're living our way into the answer. And I think this is really the challenge to all of us, including you. The challenge is that I think that we all kind of grew up thinking that democracy would always be there. I certainly grew up in a very structured way of doing journalism, right? And now what I've realized is that every generation's democracy is built during that time. You fight for these rights. And I've been forced to do that because I myself have come under attack. And, you know, here's the thing that I respect our Constitution enough to subject myself to the court. I have come to the courts in every single one of these with a faith and a hope that they will actually stick to the spirit of the law, despite the context of the Philippines, which is, you know, the political context we live in. So the question for all of us is, you know, how far what are you willing to sacrifice for your democracy? What are you willing to sacrifice for this Constitution that people think is just paper, but it is so much? So as you've said, a lot of things have happened. Here's another context that's changed. Before COVID-19, before the lockdown, would you ever have thought that hashtag oust Duterte now would trend #1 in the Philippines and would trend globally? And I know exactly when it happened. It happened on April 1. It wasn't an April Fool's joke, but it happened on April 1 when President Duterte, in one of his late night ramblings, told the police that he told everybody, look, stay at home, right? We were going to do that anyway because Filipinos follow. And you can see from the data, the mobility data of phones, we've had the toughest lockdown and we've stayed home. But he said, stay at home. And he told the police that if anyone violates quarantine, that they should, and this is his quote, shoot them dead. Shoot them dead. The next day, a 63-year-old farmer gets stopped at a checkpoint. He's not wearing a mask. And the police report says that he came at them with a bolo and he was shot dead. And then, of course, we know Winston Ragas, right? So the question that we have is that night, hashtag oust Duterte now trended.
But survey after survey, President Duterte appears to remain popular. I mean, it's not just a popularity survey, but, you know, it's a satisfaction survey as well. A general satisfaction survey, satisfaction over the handling of the pandemic.
Let me again say that there hasn't really been a survey about the handling of the pandemic. But one of the things that you can look at is, again, the impact of the propaganda machine. We're calling it the propaganda machine, right? And that AstroTurf's support. Having said that, let me again make clear, I would love for President Duterte to stay popular and to use that immense popularity to heal the divides of this society. The government has amplified that divide, but in order to deal effectively with COVID-19, you must unite us. And that's the bigger challenge for any leader around the world, right? It's a tough one to unite people. It's easy to incite anger and hate. And I think that's part of what this government is growing up to do. You know, that's what they're grappling with. And I wish that they would focus on that more than they would on the perceived critics.
Mm-hmm. And maybe the larger context here, I mean, the attacks against journalists isn't just happening in the Philippines. And we saw very recently what has been happening in the United States, and the attacks were actually physical. You know, I mean, in the Philippines, we've not really seen journalists being attacked physically by the police. So, what do you make of this in terms of democracy all throughout the world?
So, I think two things, and these are two trends that are global. Number one is kind of the rise of fascism. Again, we're going back to a period of time. And that's one of the reasons I really like Tim Snyder's On Tyranny. Number two is the fact that the largest distributor of news globally are no longer news groups. It is Facebook. And that in this instance, you know, when I was working for CNN, we owned both. We created the journalism and we distributed it ourselves. Now that distribution power has been stripped away, journalists are no longer the gatekeepers. during the time when we could be held accountable, and we protected the public sphere. We did a lot of things that are bad for business, like what I'm doing for Rappler now. Very bad for business. We did things that were bad for business, but good for the public sphere. Well, when we handed the gatekeeping powers to tech platforms, they abdicated responsibility. And we now live in an age where lies laced with anger and hate spread faster than really boring facts. And that has led to a period of time when facts are debatable, right? So if you look at the way the algorithms of any social media platform works, if before, and here in the Philippines, we watched this happen beginning in 2016, all of the news groups tend to be in the center, the major news groups, right? But then what happened is that there was excessive pounding. And if you were pro-Duterte, you move here. And the filter bubbles that are built into the design of the social media platforms took the pro-Duterte, because they're only talking amongst themselves, they move further here. And the anti-Duterte, because they don't hear the pro-Duterte, they move further away. So we now have this chasm in the public sphere, and lies are dominating this. What do we do? It's not just happening in the Philippines. And I think the reason why the Philippines is interesting to the rest of the world is because we were ahead of everyone. Our dystopian present has now become every other democracy's present, but we were first. I hate to be, Glenda Gloria, our managing editor, wrote a piece where she said, where the Philippines goes, America follows. That's exactly what's happening right now.
And when you hear Mark Zuckerberg, for example, saying, Facebook should not be acting on political statements in a way Twitter has acted on political statements. I mean, Rappler is a partner of Facebook. You are a fact checker of Facebook. How do you feel about that?
We're frenemies. And we are fact-checking partners because that's important in the ecosystem. It's important for Rappler. It's important for Facebook. But I think that Mark Zuckerberg's statements are disingenuous. And when he says that, it's a freedom of speech issue, this isn't a freedom of speech issue. Because, and I'll quote a comedian, Sacha Baron Cohen said, freedom of speech is not freedom of reach. Distribution of these lies far outweigh the distribution of the boring facts. And that is a choice. It's a choice made by the algorithms of Facebook, the design of Facebook, and they were programmed by human beings. So when Mark Zuckerberg says, you don't want us to be the arbiter of free speech, you don't want us to be the censors, they already are. It's just they've made choices that are inimical to democracy. They've made choices that kill democracy. And in my case, they've made choices that have made me more vulnerable than I would have been if Facebook didn't exist, right? For journalists today, if you're on Facebook, Facebook strips away the protections that our Philippine Constitution has in place for journalists. And this is an age-long battle. But, I used to think that 2020 was going to be the year that we would fight the battle for truth. And it's tech-enabled. The future of journalism is tech-enabled. The rise of authoritarian populist-style leaders globally is tech-enabled. So all of this is a root. We still have to deal with this. And I look at the silver lining in the way the social media platforms are dealing with COVID-19. They're taking content down. Right? They're taking content by politicians down. They've taken Jair Bolsonaro down from Brazil. They've taken down Rudy Giuliani's tweets. They've put a warning. Twitter better than Facebook. They put a warning on President Trump's tweets. I think the problem with Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook is that Mark Zuckerberg has tremendous power on Facebook, and Facebook now controls the information ecosystem of the world. That's huge power. And
can I just zero in on what happened recently here in the Philippines? As you know, and as our viewers probably know, thousands of accounts were, what word would I use? Shadowed, maybe. I found 3 different accounts with my name misspelled, actually. So I can't be sure that those accounts were actually my ghost accounts, but they sure did look like they were my ghost accounts. What do you think happened there?
So only Facebook really knows. And I've seen Facebook statements back, right? Because they'll say, so if everybody knows what happened, the activists who were arrested in Cebu, is it 2 weekends ago? The activists who were arrested found they had what they called ghost accounts, accounts in their names. And then as more people began to look, everyone realized that if you had signed the anti-terror, this petition against it, that you seemed to have it. And then I had numerous accounts, all of which have been cleared, by the way, right? Facebook's response was to actually say that they were going to investigate it. That was on Sunday night. And then they came out with a more recent statement where they said, well, those accounts were there before and not all of them were created then. And I mean, frankly, the way I reacted to that is it doesn't matter when they were created. They were discovered now and they're causing fear among your users. That requires action. And I think that's the biggest problem. There is no incentive for Facebook to act to protect its users. In fact, they put the onus of protection on the users. We have to report it. And when I was getting an average of 90 hate messages per hour, I told them I didn't even have enough hours in the day if I was going to report every one of those, right? So I think this is a problem with Facebook. I think that I'll talk about that Sunday because some of the folks who contributed to Rappler were young, 16, 17 years old. They're in Move PH. They were scared. There were people who had found cloned accounts. Fear went through a lot of Filipinos that Sunday. And I think Facebook needs to own the responsibility of that, right? They should give us a better response and a better action point.
It really is a double-edged sword, isn't it? I mean, Rappler also lives on Facebook. I mean, Rappler lives on social media as well.
Yes.
We all do.
Right? But that's also why we know it so well. And again, I have some amazing friends inside Facebook who I know are trying to do the right thing. We are partners of Facebook, but right now they're failing dismally. And you don't solve a problem until you own it. And so, Mr. Zuckerberg, please own the problem.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, we only have a few more minutes left. Unfortunately, I think you have another engagement. So let me just go back to what's happening tomorrow. I mean, it's not the end of the story. Tomorrow is just a decision for one case, and you are facing, if I'm not mistaken, at least seven more cases.
There are 8 cases, so there's 7 more left. Criminal cases.
Yes, 7 more cases. So whatever the outcome tomorrow, how do you carry on? Because at the end of the day, there is a possibility for Rappler itself to get shut down. So, yes. So, I mean, the story doesn't end tomorrow, does it?
No, but I think you already know what to expect from Rappler, right? We've already done our scenario building. I'm a workflow person. We have workflows to handle everything. And I would say, you prepare for the worst. And when I mean prepare for the worst, like if I walked into a war zone, I was in charge of a lot of the evacuation procedures when I was with CNN. I was handling a lot of these things. So we have workflows for this. I guess I don't want to talk about that as much as what that means. Yes, tomorrow's verdict will happen. And regardless of what it is, we keep doing our jobs. And I'm hoping that by doing that, by holding the line, that our counterparts in government will realize that we are actually working for the same thing, which is to make a better society, to find answers to the same questions. When they don't know what to do. And it would be better if they actually said it, right? Barnaby, how bad are we at asking questions? I mean, we ask questions so that we get answers for the public. Strategic communications for government isn't critically important. And that is done with the journalists. I think a lot more of this work should be done. It's a very old-fashioned way of looking at loyalty as the underpinning of a complex system of governance. I think this needs to evolve, and I hope that's what tomorrow will bring, right? So I hope for the best. I'm hoping that our professional judge will follow the rule of law, will help define what will happen in the future, and that I'll go on and face the other 7 charges after that. Having said that, if it isn't and we're convicted, the impact will be immediate on every Filipino, and we'll still continue doing our jobs. Does that make sense?
Well, unfortunately, Maria, we have to leave it at that. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but we'd like to thank you, and we'd like to thank our viewers. And of course, we wish you the best. We wish our country the best. We wish that justice will prevail. And my apologies for not being able to take questions from our Facebook viewers. We've run out of time. But again, thank you, Maria. Thank you, everyone, for joining us in this episode of Viewpoint. Do catch us on NYK's Facebook page regularly every Saturday. But this week is on Sunday, but regularly every Saturday at 6 p.m. Again, my name is Barnaby Lo, and this is Viewpoint.